Today's podcast episode is going to sound a little weird, but how I love to present my episodes to you is whether I have a guest or whether it's just me talking. I always like to relate the story or the guest interview with how there's the universe speaking to us or a little woo woo, as I call it, involved in the choices we make and the things we do and how our life unfolds. So today I thought, and the reason why I'm doing this today is because I woke up this morning and I didn't have an idea for today's podcast episode. And I always like to ask my higher self, either through before I go to sleep at night to wake up with an idea, or just as I'm sitting in silence. And I usually get a message. I get some kind of message, and then I'm think sometimes it's odd, but okay, because I've learned to follow my gut in that. And I know that whatever is sent is something, especially if I preface the request with what does my audience need to hear, it is usually something that will be helpful. So I usually sit like I did this morning and prep. Okay, I had that download. Now, how does that relate to how it can be of use to the listener? And of course, something came up very quickly. Actually, about three things in this story that are really interesting ways of looking at how my life, number one, unfolded in this story from childhood to adulthood. And secondly, how the crime that I'm going to talk about, how it was solved with the universe's help. So it's some crazy stuff. And if you like crime dramas or you like whodunits, and you like when bad guys get caught, this is something that you're going to want to listen to. And I also, if you are into that stuff, I have a couple of books that I'm going to recommend that you might want to read as I'm telling the story. So here we go. Okay, I'm going to jump right into the story because you're probably intrigued. Who was this serial killer? And what is the whole story about? I was the wife of one of the two detectives that solved this pretty horrible, horrendous cases of really ultimately five murders, but four that he was actually convicted for, and I'll get into the details of the first one. And so, yes, I was married to a police officer, and he became a homicide detective in his career, and in his police department, and the way probably a lot of them work is it's kind of a rotational basis, and you work with a partner. So they had, oh gosh, I don't know. I think in total there were like 300 officers, and where we lived at the time was in the Washington D.C. area. So the police department that he worked for is called Arlington County. You can look it up in a map. It's the first county that you enter after you leave, when you enter Virginia, after you leave Washington, D.C. And so it's right on the border of, in fact, the Potomac River divides Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And so it's right on the Potomac River. In fact, a couple of landmarks actually are in Arlington County. The Pentagon is in Arlington County, and the National Cemetery is in, which is a famous place to visit. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers are there. That's in Arlington County. So he was a police officer at Arlington County Police Department. Very, very small. They don't have a lot of homicides. Very, very few a year. At least this was in the 80s, 90s when he was a police officer. He retired in like 2000. So this happened in the late 80s. And we just so happened to be living in Arlington County at the time. Most of my life, I was in the outskirts, in the suburbs of Virginia. But we lived in Arlington County. So when he got assigned this case, we actually lived in Arlington County. And it's funny I say that because it probably doesn't have a lot of meaning to you, the listener. But I remember vividly conversations that were held in the kitchen, the old time phones we used to have that had the cords, and with this long cord, and he would talk to his partner for hours on end trying to figure out who this serial killer was. And initially they didn't know it was a serial killer. They just knew that somebody had murdered somebody in Arlington and they were assigned the case. So they, like I said, it's a rotational basis. So by chance, he and his partner got this case. And I don't think it would have been solved if it was anybody else who got this case, because there were a couple of things. Like I said, this is a little woo-woo. And what I will tell you is that there were a couple of things that happened that I believe the universe was leading these two detectives to solve this murder case. And fortunately, they were paying attention to their instincts. So I first want to begin, after that little overview, of talking about me as a child and what I was interested in. And I talk to people about purpose a lot, and I talk to people about how our thoughts create our reality. And so you have to be careful about what you think, because or be aware be aware of your thoughts. And if you're thinking really bad thoughts of what you don't want, you have to be careful of that, because the universe is listening. And the universe is listening to your thoughts. And so if depending on what you're doing and what you're thinking, that will ultimately result in that reality coming into your life. And so when I was a child, I loved reading, and I was fascinated with books about like crime. I loved Nancy Drew. I don't know if anybody remembers Nancy Drew, but she was always solving puzzles, and often they were like whodunits kind of thing. And then my parents got this book called Blood Letters and Bad Men. I looked it up on Amazon. It's been republished. In fact, it's a 1995 copyright date now. And I was like so frustrated, because I was like, I know I read it earlier and I couldn't find the earlier copyright date. So I looked at the reviews, and somebody in the review said, I loved this book when I read it in 1975. But what Blood Letters and Bad Men is it's the description is it's a narrative encyclopedia of America's criminals from Pilgrims to present. I just remember it being this big, huge, humongous book that no kid would want to read. Well, in 1975, I was a junior in high school. So, if it was copyrighted then, I was somewhere in my late high school years. And so I loved this book because it had, the way it was written in encyclopedia form, was these short stories essentially of these criminals from, like John Dillinger to Bonnie and Clyde to there was a guy, what was his name? Richard something. He killed a bunch of nurses. Of course, Ted Bundy was in the book. I think Ted Bundy had, maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure when Ted Bundy did his crimes, but if he had done them before 1975, then he was in the book, but he might not have. There was another guy, Ed Gein. I remember he was terrible. He actually initially dug up graves, and he would freeze the body parts of the people. But then his friend who was helping him dig the graves, he like worked at the cemetery. It's funny what you remember, right? It was just so horrible. And then when the guy died who helped him dig up the dead bodies, he just decided to kill somebody, because he didn't have his helper to help him dig up dead bodies anymore. So I just remember he had made and this is probably why he stuck out so much to me. He had made a mobile out of lips that he dangled in his kitchen on a string. So that's the kind of thing. Like it was just this book that was like, you'd read these stories, you'd be like, oh my gosh, crazy stuff, right? So anyways, I loved this book, and my parents used to say to me, you're going to be a detective one day. So they would make these comments. Little did I know that I would end up marrying a police officer. And when we married, he was just a beat cop. He was just on the street. He was what they call police officer one, bottom of the rung. He had only been in the police department like a couple of years. And then when you get promoted in his department to police officer two, and police officer twos can apply to be a detective. So there's a process you have to go through, or he had to go through. You had to get promoted, and then you have to get selected. And the people who are detectives, they are in those roles forever. They don't ever want to go anywhere else. So the fact that an opening would happen was rare. And so when an opening comes up, and there's a lot of people competing for it. So he got accepted as a detective, and he got placed with a partner, Joe. And so that in and of itself is crazy, right? Because I had this interest, and I didn't become a detective, but in my reality, one was presented to me. Even though he wasn't one at the time, he became one. And so when I would think about that later in life, and this is before I ever even knew how the universe plants seeds and how the universe lays breadcrumbs, and I didn't know any of that stuff. And so he, as a detective, he not only did murders, but because they didn't have a lot of murders, like I said, but he would do like robberies and burglaries and things like that too. So anyways, always fascinating stories. Fast forward to the case that he and Joe were assigned, which was in the 87, the latter part of 87. What happened was a woman was in Arlington, home alone. Her husband was on a business trip, and she was home alone, and the killer got in through a basement window, and he the way he killed her was terrible. He raped her while she was alive, with ligatures choking her, and then she was killed. She was strangled ultimately. And so it became clear in the investigation that he specced out the house, that he knew she was going to be alone, and he got into the house and was waiting for her. So kind of like really scary, creepy. It was very scary. It was a scary time because well, at the time we did not know he was a serial killer. We knew that this bad murder had happened. It was around Thanksgiving is when it happened. So a couple of things that were kind of serendipitous were that my ex-husband and I had gone to visit my college best friend who lives 2 hours away in Richmond, Virginia, which is south of DC. And we had gone to visit her and had stayed with her. And she told us about this murderer had killed 3 women in Richmond in a very short period of time, over like a month or 6 weeks or something. And they had dubbed him the South Side Strangler because he was strangling people. And granted, this was like September, October, before my husband was assigned the case. So she was so freaked out. And this is a roommate. I love her dearly. She's still one of my best friends. But she would, in college, go to sleep with a butter knife under her pillow because she was so afraid of like things that could come in the night. And I would say a butter knife, that's not going to hurt anybody, but made her feel safer. So here she was, and living in this town that a serial murderer was running rampant. And it was really terrible. And her husband was a salesman, so he would travel. So she had done this thing with her windows where she had these like little rods put in the window, so you couldn't you couldn't jimmy the window and raise it because it had these little steel thingies in them. I'd never seen anything like it, but that's how like scared she was. And so that's just a little nugget I want to share, because fast forward, my ex-husband gets the call. There's this murder. So he and his partner started to investigate this crime. And of course, his gut was like, this seems really familiar to what was happening in Richmond. I wonder what because these jurisdictions really don't talk to each other much. There's like not like this. I mean, I think there's a bulletin when there's like be on the lookout for, but I don't think there was much awareness that this was happening in Richmond. But my ex-husband, because we had been there recently and he heard about this, they contacted the Richmond Police Department to learn more about these crimes, because there's some similarities here, right? And there was an exact pattern. You can tell when what its MO is similar. And the other crazy thing is that the Richmond Police Department had done and taken DNA samples from the crimes. Now, this is 87. DNA was very, very new technology, and it took many weeks to get results. It wasn't the technology it is today. And so Arlington County had never done any kind of DNA testing for any crimes. It was brand new to them. And so because Richmond had done DNA testing, they said, well, let's do DNA testing on this because then we can see if it's the same person. And again, it takes quite some time to get those results back. So they did. They eventually, like 6 weeks it would take, they got the DNA samples back, and it was the same person who had killed 3 women in Richmond. And so they started to, they got a FBI crime profiler on the case. And the profiler, what they do is they look at the case, they look at the similarities of the cases, kind of the locations of the cases and that sort of thing, and then they put together a profile of who they think the person who would do something like this would be. So they had a little bit of a knowing that from this FBI, like it's just like a psychology profile that says these are the characteristics of somebody who would do a crime like this. So one of the characteristics of somebody who would do a crime like that was somebody who was a juvenile delinquent, and somebody who had probably set fires. Isn't that crazy? Who would think that like somebody who set fires would later kill somebody? I didn't know there was that correlation, but apparently there is. And so they had that little nugget. And then they also started thinking, Richmond is where 3 happened, and Arlington is where 1 happened. So there's a tie between these 2 cities that this person has. And the one that happened in Arlington was over Thanksgiving timeframe. So the working theory was this was probably somebody who lived like his home, his childhood, maybe because he was home visiting his family or his friends, was in Arlington. So that was a little bit of a working theory they had. And so what they did is they just started, I mean, this is just true detective work, right? They're talking a lot. They're looking through evidence a lot. They're talking to the FBI. And when what I think is so interesting about detectives is they really have to go with their instinct a lot. They use their instinct to follow up on something, and there's a lot of things to follow up on, right? And so you have to prioritize those things, and so you have to let your instinct lead you to what's the most important to do right now. What do we need to do? But they talked every single night for like an hour. And as a mom with young kids, I was probably not the most supportive because I was like, when are you going to get off the phone? You've been on the phone for an hour. But yet at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, and I knew this guy was going to kill somebody else. It was just a matter of time. But Mike's partner, Mike was my ex-husband, and he had been a detective for many, many years. He was one of those who never leaves. He never left he was there till he retired. And my ex-husband ultimately moved on. He got promoted again and moved out. He ended up later in his career going back as the head of the homicide department, which that is amazing as well. But in this situation, he was one of the detectives, and Joe was, because he had been a detective for so long, he had remembered a kid who had set fire to his mother's car when he was like 13 or 14, but he couldn't remember his name. But he had worked the case a few years back. So it turned out the killer was in his like early 20s, and so it had been several years, probably like 10 years. But he remembered his mind went to this. That's your gut. And that is a knowing. He had a knowing inside of him, and he didn't try to force logic into it. He just had this knowing, and he was like, every single night for, I think it was like 3 days, because I remember my ex-husband telling me he remembers this kid, and he's trying to remember his name, and he can't remember his name. And guess what? And that's what the brain does. The universe really helps you. If you have a question and you desire an answer, you if you're patient, it will come. It came. He had this name. It was like Timothy Spencer. It's Timothy Spencer. That's the kid who set fire to his mom's car. So he got on the computer and he started looking, Timothy Spencer, Timothy Spencer. So what he did was figured out, what came up on the computer was he had been in prison for 3 years. And so he had gotten released from prison. He had went to prison on a burglary charge. And so he was released from prison and was in a halfway house. So they found out, okay, he was out of prison. He was in a halfway house. He had the freedom. He was in Richmond. The halfway house is in Richmond. And so they were like, okay, we're going to like pursue this lead. This kid matches the FBI profile. And although there was one difference on the FBI profile, the FBI profile said that the person would be white, and Timothy was a black man. So that was one difference. So the profile isn't always completely accurate, but what part of the profile was accurate, and they didn't let that differentiation of race deter them from thinking. Then that's what the logic brain can do. Oh no, it can't be that because the profile says this. But no, they were just following the lead that said this kid probably started fires, probably had a little angsty against his mother, right? Because who is he killing? Women, right? In a tortuous way. So they pursued this lead, and they went to the halfway house and checked the records. And guess what? Timothy had checked out and didn't check in on the evenings, or checked it. I think they had a curfew of a certain time. They had to be in by 10 p.m. or something. And he didn't check in time. He missed curfew. So, hey, there's a little evidence there, a little patterning there. Meanwhile, they're doing this while they're waiting for the DNA to come back to say, is this the same guy that did these Richmond things? So all these pieces, you have to put these pieces of the puzzle together to go before a grand jury to have enough evidence that the grand jury says, yeah, you can arrest him. And DNA, like I said, was very, very new then. And so they had to have more proof other than just the DNA, although the DNA is pretty convincing. But they had to piece together what they thought happened and how he could have been the one, how there was evidence to show that it was likely him. But the other key thing about this case, which is crazy, is that prior to him being in prison for 3 years, there was another rape and murder in Arlington County. And the unfortunate thing about that is that the wrong person was put in prison. So not only were they trying to solve these 4 recent murders, there was a murder that had happened 4 years previously, and they were realizing, oh my gosh, we think this guy did that. And so that was the problem, a big problem. Plus the detective that helped convict the person who was in prison was still a detective. So that's a difficult situation when you're basically telling your one of your peers that they put the wrong guy in prison. That created a little bit of, friction, I would say, in the detective bureau. but you don't want the wrong person to be in prison, right? So the problem with the person being in prison is they confessed. So, when you confess, it's hard to be not guilty. Turns out this was a kid that lived in the neighborhood. He was young. I think he was like 19 years old, and he was learning disabled, and he was wandering the streets at night. And so he was picked up and questioned in the way that is not the way that you see it on Dateline, right? Really kept too long and too tired, and just he I mean, this happens to really smart people, and he didn't have his parents with him. Obviously, he was old enough to not have his parents with him, but someone who was of learning disabled, easy to take advantage of, and so they had that to deal with. So they ended up getting the DNA back and realizing this is the guy. This is the guy. He's done both the crimes. They were able to find DNA from the earlier crime as well. They had saved things, right? That's what they do with crime scenes. They have a box in the basement of the department somewhere. I've seen it on TV. And so they had, still like her clothes that they could get DNA from, because DNA when she was killed wasn't a thing. But they had it. That's how a lot of these cold cases are being solved. And so they got her clothing, and they were able to determine that he did that as well. And the person who was wrongly convicted was exonerated, and I think he was given like $1 million. So he was not that gives him his 4 years back, but it did exonerate him, fortunately. But if they hadn't have found Timothy Spencer, he would have committed more murders, and that person would have remained in prison for the rest of his life. And so yes, so the intuition of knowing that who this is, and you just got to think of his name. And isn't that that to me, that would be so stressful, because he's out there, and he's going to kill somebody else. But fortunately, they were able to arrest him. They arrested him in January. I actually Googled this because I was like, I want to have my facts right, because at the timing, I just remember I remember how long we lived in Arlington, but I remember them being on the phone all the time. And I remember the case. So he was arrested in January of 88, and my ex-husband went to pick him up in Richmond and drove with him for 2 hours to Arlington County Jail, where he was placed under arrest. And he didn't think he was going to get arrested, because he didn't know anything about DNA. And so when they arrested him, they knew that it was pretty well. I actually, let me say this. I did get this wrong. They didn't have the DNA results by the time they arrested him. They just had a lot of, evidence that it was probably him. And so the DNA results hadn't come back yet. And so when they got him arrested, they were still waiting. They were still waiting for the results, and then they got the results. So that was a very stressful time, because they were worried, what if these results aren't right? But they had enough evidence to at least arrest him and get him off the street before he murdered anybody else. But I remember my ex-husband saying, he's actually a nice guy to talk to. You never know. Evil lurks, and you don't know what somebody's thinking in their head. And he also said he was very kind of, I don't want to say sassy, but he just had this air of confidence that he wasn't going to get caught. He didn't think there was proof enough to catch him, because, like I said, he didn't know about DNA. A lot of people didn't know about how it's like, yeah, if it matches, you're going down. And so that was an amazing experience to witness. And as you can imagine, hearing my backstory about how fascinated I am with these kind of things, and I love Dateline, and I love these mysteries. And what I've learned about myself is, and I think you should question this about yourself, is what are the things that are interesting you? Maybe they've been something, a pattern your whole life, something that's interested you, but how is that showing up in your life today? And what I've come to realize is people fascinate me and what makes them tick. And so somebody who murders somebody is to me like, what is going on there? I want to figure it out. And that's why I like these competition reality shows, because like your real personality comes out. And I love watching people. I could sit in a mall all day and watch people. And it's so funny that when I went out to Utah to mentor with, to work with my mentor, Alex Paulos, that's what we did. Like, he reads people. And so as he was teaching me how to read people, we went to malls. That was the assignment. And I was like, oh, I used to do this when I was a kid, but I didn't know like really that I could read people. If only I knew how to do that then, that would have like, I would have never left the mall. I would sit there all night and the next day. But yeah, I think if you have a fascination for people, and like I do, and you think, oh, that's just weird, or gosh, uh, that's unhealthy. Well, I think it might be leading you to something you should do, or some activity. Like maybe you should volunteer at a suicide hotline, or maybe you should, get trained in really how to understand and coach people, how to like question them in a way that can help them and help them live a better life, or help them find a better way. So I think these things in our past are those like whispers, are those breadcrumbs, are those uh nuggets that are leading us to what interests us. I mean, it is what interests us. And it's leading us to like, this path. There's something on this path of interest that will make your life purposeful, that will make your life uh because when we're working on purposeful things, we want to find them interesting. And so what is it that is interesting you? And how has that come true in your reality? How has that surfaced in your reality? Has anything that you did when you're a child that you thought a lot about become your reality as an adult? Good or bad? So the couple things I want to recommend in terms of books as I wrap this up is that there was a book written about this case, in case you want to read more about it. But it's called Stalking Justice. And it was written, it was written or in early 90s after the case, or yeah, I think it was written sometime in the 90s. Because yeah, he was arrested in January of 88, and then he was put to death. So this is actually the first case in the United States where a serial killer was convicted with using DNA evidence. So it was a pretty incredible time, because he was convicted of capital murder, which is in the state of Virginia, death penalty. And so so he was actually put to death. So he is no longer being we are no longer spending our tax dollars on his food and beverages, and room and board, put it that way. So yeah, so the book Stalking Justice is something by Paul Mones, Mones. I'll put these links in the show notes. And then another book that I had read, which I found super fascinating, was called, and back in the day when I was reading things other than self-help books, because that's about all I read now. But this was called The Blooding, and it's by Joseph Wambaugh. And what is interesting is this is an English, a serial killer and serial killer. Yeah. When you kill more than one person, 2 teenage girls were killed in the early 80s, well, 83 and 86. And it's very similar to this case. Somebody was put in jail. See, DNA evidence has DNA technology has helped so many people, so many innocent people from going to prison. And so it is just, I'm grateful for that technology. But anyways, it happened in this village in England. And so it's called the blooding because they had this massive blood drawing exercise. Like over 5,000 people in this village were their blood was drawn. Yeah, so that is the story about that English case, and of course DNA was used. So this case happened prior to Timothy Spencer. So that's why Timothy Spencer was the first case in the United States and America, but it wasn't the first case in the world, because I think this one, the blooding, was the first case in the world where this happened. And so, yeah, so that was an interesting read. And that was, written in 1990. So these are a little bit older books, but if you're interested in these stories, I thought this would be an interesting take on how the universe is always listening and helping if we allow it to help us. And I love this story because it truly helped these 2 detectives, and they paid attention. And I think detectives that are successful, there's a lot of intuition that has to go into that, and to get these evil people off the streets. So this little fun fact you might not have known about me. My ex-husband and I are still friends. He and I were married for like 25, 26 on paper years. And he went on after being a police officer to build a business. He loved flying. We both had our pilot's license. And in fact, I was getting my pilot's license when we went on our first date. He picked me up at Dulles Airport after a lesson I had. I often think he married me because he was fascinated in flying. And so we had our pilot's license. And so that was a real fascination of his and hobby. And then after he left the police department, got into an aviation business. And so that was incredible because he went on for 10 years after that to build a business, be an entrepreneur. And then he got into real estate. So really successful real estate person. So I think he's retired now, unless business comes to him. I think he's mostly retired, but yeah. So that is, and there is a Lifetime TV show, or, it's one of those, I think it's Forensic Files, in fact. So Forensic Files, there is an episode on this case. So Joe and my ex-husband are in this. My ex-husband's the one with the real big black bushy mustache. So that's my past, one of my stories that you might not have known about. I hope you got something out of it and it resonated with you, but it came from a download this morning as I was waking up. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much for tuning into the Living Your Spark Second Half podcast. If you'd like to watch my guest interviews, you can find the video version of this podcast on my Not Your Average Grandma YouTube channel. Also, you can check out what I have going on at the moment by going to my website at notyouraveragegrandma.com, or find me on Instagram or Facebook at notyouraveragegrandma. If you like this episode, please mention it to a friend, and don't forget to leave a review so I know the topics you like best and can bring you more of that content in upcoming episodes. Last but not least, remember to always listen to that inner voice that will never steer you wrong, and make living from the most sparked place possible your biggest priority. When we do that, we make the world a better place.